the original of this kind of presentation here, which was designed to sort of try and give some practical guidelines as to what you might expect to find, and maybe just point out some of the issues that you might encounter along the way. Now, since then, and mainly due to Nuala's efforts, I think, as we see in conjunction with Colin, etc., we've actually created quite a lot of supports now in terms of the OSC20 module itself. So you had the library session, you've got a session on ethics, etc. So you've got exemplars. So there's a lot of material now that's been built up over the period, and that's kind of available for us. Some of what we used to try and capture in the course of this presentation, I'm going to glide over because they've already been covered elsewhere, so there's no point trying to do things more than once. The other aspect of it is really that it's kind of, I want to avoid, there's various rules and regulations that you probably know about in terms of how you have to present your dissertation and when you have to do things, etc. And I don't really want to spend the time kind of going page by page through the program handbook. So there are rules, I'll kind of advert to some of them, but don't really want to spend the time going through the rule book. You can read through that yourselves in your own time. But the most important thing, I think, is that it is your session. The whole idea of this is to try and address any issues, concerns, or queries that you might have in your own mind. So do please contribute. Now, I know Nuala said there's a Q&A kind of at the end of this, but really it makes more sense to just ask questions as we go along. Okay, so if there's anything I'm saying that you don't agree with, or you don't understand, or you've got a counter point of view to put, or whatever the case may be, please put your hand. You'll be surprised when you ask a question how many other people have the same issue, so don't be afraid to bear it. So it's a practical guide really to surviving your dissertation. Okay, so it's really trying to put together kind of what myself, the various other supervisors, etc., have encountered in terms of trying to help students get through the dissertation over the years, and trying to kind of distill those into things that we think you should watch out for, just to try and give you a heads up on problems that you might encounter, so that you can sort of take actions that will help you avoid them as you go on. Now, one of the things that Nuala did ask me to do was to pop up the learning outcomes for the OSC20 module, and I think really, rather than just sort of putting them up and saying, well, these are the learning outcomes that you should be working towards, it is actually, they do directly address some of the things that you're going to be doing as you work through your dissertation. So it is worth actually looking at these. I know sometimes learning outcomes you can go, yeah, blah, 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 let's get on to the stuff we actually need to look at. But in point of fact, your ability to work independently, to get your critical thinking heads on, is very important, because as you work through, for example, doing your literature review, you need to be thinking critically about what you're reading. You need to be sort of working independently now as a researcher. That's really what you're doing as you work your way through the dissertation. Importantly, therefore, number two, you've got to come up with a kind of research methodology that's coherent and that makes sense and that ties in with what you're actually studying in your own dissertation, kind of research objectives that you have. And you'll see that's a theme that's running through it, is to have a coherent approach to everything, a logical and coherent thread that runs through the whole thing. Because that's particularly when the markers, etc., are looking at your finished product. What they'll be looking at is to say, okay, here's an original set of research questions. Is there now a methodology that links in and is compatible with that and supports it? Is the primary research that was done logical in that context? Does it actually address the research questions that were raised? And then is it all tied together at the end into a coherent whole? So this idea of coherence and a kind of logical run through is very important. And as you're doing that, you will be demonstrating your independence as a researcher, your ability to think critically and to analyse what other people are doing, and to add to the body of knowledge in whatever the particular research area is that you've chosen. And hopefully have a little bit of enjoyment and feelings of personal satisfaction along the way as well. So these are the kind of the basic requirements. You've got to do a dissertation 15,000 words, give or take. So you need to stay within about 10% of that, a little bit like you did during the assignments. Okay. That figure was 20,000 up to a couple of years ago, but it's been pared back to 15 to kind of, that seems to be the standard now for master's dissertations. You need to complete it by the 31st of July. I don't know if any of you or many of you are still doing modules alongside of it, or if you're just doing the dissertation. Is that hands up? Anybody who's doing modules still alongside? Okay, so this is fair enough. All right, so that's a little bit more of a challenge because you have to kind of push everything along with all the other things you have in your lives, work and family and all those other stakeholders that have to be kept on side as you try and work through this. Okay, and it's got to be in a specific format, spacing and all that stuff. Okay, and again, these are the kind of sanitation issues that you can read up on. And you'll be handing in 2 softbound copies in an electronic copy. And then for certain ones, there'll be a requirement for a hardbound copy if they're going to be going into the library. One of the things that is worth mentioning is that your dissertation becomes a publication of DCU, so it's in the public domain at that point. And if any of you are doing things that involve your own organizations, your own companies, and if you are dealing with things that may have commercial sensitivity or something like that, then you need to bear that in mind. Okay, and I'll probably mention this later, but I might as well mention it now, is that if you are doing an internal project where you're looking at your own organization, as early as possible, get permission to do it from your own organization. We've had a number of cases where people have been trundling along, going to do things, and then at the last moment, or a long way down the line, management in the organization has said, "No, hang on a second, we can't really, be divulging stuff like this, or this isn't for public consumption." So, if you are looking at your own organization, make sure your management is aware early on and get their approval, and do it in a formal way. Don't just have a casual conversation with someone. Actually put something in writing that says, "Here's what I'm doing, here's the backup documentation, etc. I need your permission to do it." And kind of make sure that you're covered in that way. There are
and just one thing, John. There, sorry, John. Allow your organisation levels of sanitation, so that we're agreeing here, but keep our name off everything.
Yeah. So that's a good point. You can. We don't need to know that you're Microsoft. You just mentioned in the organisation, Tom did a second ago. And you can call yourself the Acme software company. Names don't matter as such, so you can anonymize the organisation. There's also a facility whereby you can keep publication held back for a number of years. Now that's a kind of formal process that you need to go through with DCU. So there are a couple of ways around it if you are dealing with somewhat sensitive information, commercial information. But just to be aware of it, kind of don't just assume that it's okay, and then you'll walk into trouble a fair way down the road.
Sorry, John, just one other point while you're there. The deadline is hard in terms of 31st.
The 31st of July.
Yeah, where we would have some leeway on assignments, so that in the past you would have been able to get an extension, and with the dissertation there is no leeway because the process follows into the programme board or the professional awards board. The things have to be corrected, and there's a very tight timeline there. So if you find, don't imagine that you can come with a month to go and say, "This is not, I need an extension," because it's just, there's no room there. So you need to stay tight to your milestone.
Yeah, it has to be. To get you graduated in November, there's a whole list of university steps that have to be gone through, and they're set in stone. So, we can't come said with the assignments, there's a certain amount of leeway, but we start to hit formal stuff now. There just isn't any way forward through it. Anyway, this is my proposal for what we're going to cover. But again, if any of this, if you're all, for example, if you've all chosen a topic for your dissertation, then there's no point in me, spending a lot of time talking about that. Now, I will talk a little bit about the structure of the dissertation, and again, that's fairly set in stone. The literature review we'll spend a little bit of time on because it's a substantial part of your final document, and it's something that I think you need a structured approach to doing the literature review rather than a very unstructured approach to it. So we'll say a little bit about that. As I mentioned at the start, we used to try and cover library resources, research ethics. Now you've got separate sessions for those now, and separate resources available, so I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about sources, but not about the kind of library resources, because I know Ronan Cox did a session, and it was recorded, and it is available on Loop for you to have a look at, even if you couldn't make it on the day. Talk a bit about the primary research that you have to do yourselves, okay, this is kind of your contribution to the body of knowledge. I am going to talk a little bit about the conclusion section, and that's more a warning off feeling that the conclusion section is something that you can just wrap up, you know, in a few pages, and you don't have to worry about it and all the work's been done. Because this is a point at which an awful lot of good and potentially very good dissertations fall down. Okay, whitewash fever. Okay, some general points, and then just a couple of examples on the use of sources. So, does that seem reasonable? Everybody okay with that? Where are you all in terms of picking your topic? Has everybody more or less got a topic at this stage, or some of you still kind of unsure?
Yes, I have got a topic, but the more I look at it, I think it's a bit more broad scope. I've spoken to some people in my organisation, and they so invariably may want to, you know, make the scope smaller. So I'm going to have a discussion with somebody today and see what to do.
Okay, now this is, thanks, you know, this sounds like a plant, but it isn't. This is a recurring topic, which is to narrow the focus of what you're trying to do. Particularly because you've only got a certain amount of time to do it. And you know, that time will start to disappear very quickly as you get going, because you've got to do your literature review, so that's an amount of time you're not going to have available to actually be doing your primary research. So by the time you get around to actually doing your primary research, you know, the number of weeks that you've got available can suddenly start to go through your fingers. So you need to be careful with, on the scope of something that you're trying to cover, that it's doable, basically. Okay, nothing happening with this here yet again. Technology is not our friends today. Okay, I can say a little bit about this, because this is something that frequently people kind of stress a little bit about, particularly in the early stages where, you know, you're not really quite clear, maybe even the general area that you're going to talk about, and then when you get beyond the general area, as you said, trying to narrow it down in scope into something that's, you know, achievable within the context of the time that you've got available to you. So, again, you know, if just to help you, if you've already got a topic chosen, that's great. If you're kind of just still thinking about the general area, then this might help. So I would say at master's level, you want something that isn't too recent. Okay, you don't want the absolute cutting edge of whatever it is that you're looking at. The reason being, you're going to find it more challenging to put together a literature review, because there won't be any pre-existing research in this particular area. Now, there might be research in an analogous area. Again, I'll talk a little bit about historical backgrounds to things and where things develop from, because that's often very fertile ground for doing your literature review. So you don't want something that's too cutting edge, and also you're not students of history, so you don't want something that's, you know, really there isn't any kind of significant controversy or good research left in it, so that you don't want to be looking at something that's too historical. Something obviously that you know about yourselves, because you need to, the more knowledge you can bring of any subject, you know, from your working lives, etc., from your own academic background, the better, because then you're all, you know, you've got a head start. You're kind of part of the way there already. Plus, you've got some knowledge from maybe implementing this particular, you know, technology or whatever it is, methodology. So you're bringing your ability to critically think about other stuff you're reading is greatly enhanced by virtue of that. Okay, worthwhile and useful, a problem within your organisation or a problem you know about that requires resolution. You're all working in careers, so you know something that may help you, etc. So these are all things to feed into considerations to think about when you're actually coming up with your final topic. And then something bounded and accessible. So bounded in the sense, again, what we were saying, you have to do this within a certain period of time. So you know you can't set out to boil the ocean. You're not going to have time to do it. You're going to have the capability to do it or the resources available to you. So it's more likely when you get into discussions that you'll be cutting things down rather than adding to it. So again, if you've got the what is, what's new, what's to be in the future, I would say for where you are, kind of stick to what is today, kind of known issues and problems where you can get a good body of existing research on that, so you can do a good literature review on it. And then you're maybe looking at how that particular issue manifests itself in your own organisation or in a range of organisations yourselves. So give yourselves sufficient scope of literature to do it. So in terms of kind of visualising it, you can think of it as in a kind of triangle idea. So you're looking at investigating, analysing, examining your kind of active verb, something, okay, and what that something is going to be, your subject matter, okay, so whatever the case may be. So that might be outsourcing, it might be just-in-time technology, lean operations, etc. And then you've got a focus, you know, an organisational focus. So that's in either some sector or other small to medium enterprises, health sector, a particular company, etc. So you're kind of looking at what is it you're trying to do, what is the general area, and then as you start to cut it down, in what setting are you looking at that? Okay, so kind of a clear purpose and idea of what it is you're looking for, and a clear idea of where it is that you're going to be looking. Because that's going to set your agenda then in terms of both the literature review, which is the background of what you're looking at, your methodology, because certain things you're trying to establish will guide the methodology that you use, and then the locus where you're actually going to do all this will guide who you need to speak to, who you need to survey, what you need to ask them, etc., etc. So kind of, you know, think about it, and if you haven't already got a topic, I'd suggest maybe think about it in those terms. So the kind of subject areas that we've seen before, like are, you know, the impact of Lean or Six Sigma methodologies, for example, realizing the benefits of enterprise resource planning, optimizing IT usage. These are the kind of things, you know, that people have done in the past, or that you can consider looking at. So what we do have for you then are a set of past dissertation topics that you can have a look at on loop, and that will give you some good guidelines as to what people have done previously. Now, one of the kind of obvious things, I suppose, but you'd be surprised sometimes that people kind of miss this, is that your topic has to be grounded in whatever your base discipline is. So if you're doing management of operations, then your base topic has to have something to do with operations. We've had cases where people have come in trying to do dissertations on all sorts of economic, you know, and social kind of highbrow theories, and you know, it's sometimes been a struggle to. I see someone smiling at me. We both know the particular case we're talking about, but it's been difficult to kind of bring people back and ground them in the fact that if you want the university to give you a master's degree in management of operations, you've actually got to produce a dissertation that's concerned with the management of operations. Okay, so you may say, well, that's pretty obvious, but it isn't always. So, and the other thing is, and this is just a little bit of fun at somebody's expense, who thankfully remains well anonymous at this stage, but trying to, the point at issue here is trying to get an understanding or a fix on what it is that you want to do as early as possible is really important. Okay? And one of the issues that we see is that what people are trying to do kind of is somewhere on this spectrum, you know, from from that wall to that wall, but it keeps kind of moving around, and it's very hard to get a fix on what exactly is it that we're trying to do in this dissertation. So these things here, I've replaced the original words with X and Y. So these are some things that are taken from previous research proposals. So manage to navigate through the downturn, prepare itself for the Y project, fine. Look at change management process. Okay, look at the importance of planned change, identifying that, study how one organization managed to navigate the cyclical downturns, provide a review of some of the main theories, blah, blah, blah. They're all probably seem okay to you, listening to them. Nothing wrong with them. But the problem was, they were took all of them from one research proposal. Okay? So I'm reading that going, okay, so what are we actually doing here? You know, we're kind of going more from left to right, from north to south, and reading that, I'm kind of thinking, well, I have no idea what we're actually going to research here, because this is all over the place. So one of the things that somebody suggested to me ages ago was actually whenever you settle on your title, and now the title, you can change the title, the title may change a little bit as you go along, but when you do it, take it and write it kind of on the top of every page of whatever notebook you're using for your research. And I know it sounds like we're back in kindergarten school, but you'd be surprised, to keep this at the forefront of your mind. This is what you're researching, not something else. Okay, and if you're not using a notebook, if you're all electronic, etc., then copy and paste it across every page. Okay, because it's one of those things that you really need in capital letters. What is it that I'm doing? And then follow that from that point on. So that's all I'm going to say really about choosing a topic. So is everybody, if there are people who are really lost, I'd suggest maybe get in touch through Nuala and just kind of look for a bit of help. But hopefully everybody has some idea of where they're going at this stage. Is that a fair comment? Sheepish looking glances up at me from down there. Okay, so you will, and part of the issue here as well, of course, is that you have to do a research proposal. That has to be in kind of early-ish November, is it?
November.
The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, like that. Now, and so obviously your topic, at least to the extent that you have it mature in your mind at this stage, you'll outline it in that. And one of the important things to be at least in the general area of what you're going to do is those research proposals will largely form the basis of your supervisor being appointed. So what we try to do obviously is match up someone who's got some expertise or experience in the particular area that you're studying. So we match up the supervisors in that way. So it's good if you can at least be in the general area that you're going to do, so that we can give you the right supervisor. So make contact early on. This is really important. You really have to take ownership of the relationship that you have with the supervisor, or I would suggest that you do anyway. Depending on who your supervisor is, they'll have a lot of other things going on in their lives just as you do in yours. So I think you have to be the kind of noisy wheel, really, and whatever assistance or help you want, you have to look for it. Don't expect your supervisor to be the one saying, how's it going there now? Is everything okay? Can you do this for me or that for me? The supervisor will be, if you have to say who's going to be proactive and who's going to be reactive, it's really up to you to be proactive to a large extent and to push your supervisor along. Now, supervisors will be checking in, of course, and in turn we get phone calls from head office saying, okay, what's happening with your students? So there is a series of checkpoints and so on going on in the background. But I think in terms of you being the manager of your dissertation, I suggest you take the lead. Okay. Also, your supervisor will guide and advise, but they won't write for you. Okay? They won't write anything for you. You have to be, again, it's academic integrity. You're going to be the one being handed the parchment come November time, so you have to be the person who wrote the dissertation. And the other thing I would say is, listen to your supervisor's advice. advice. Again, you have to decide for yourselves what you want to do, but in general, the supervisors, you won't be the first student they've ever supervised. So again, they'll have travelled this ground a lot before, and so if they give you advice about what you're doing or the way you might go about it, I would just say, at least give it a very thorough hearing, because it's usually given for good reasons and in your own best interest.
John, just to add to what you were saying there about the supervisor not writing your dissertation together, you can't expect the supervisor to proofread your work either. So, in terms of pure courtesy, at least put your thing through a spell check before you dig it in, because there's nothing more frustrating than seeing that somebody hasn't gone to the effort to at least make it appear professional as they send in drafts along the way. And some people do think that the supervisor should be correcting your work as you go along. That's not their role. Their role is to set you on the right path. Because as John outlined at the start, this is self-directed research. Again, to emphasize what John said, you're the master of your research, and you need to have ownership of it.
Yeah. The other thing too, what I think of, just certainly the way I operate anyway, and other supervisors can jump in and say differently. So if I get a draft from someone, I will typically either put comments in it or put things in line and have them highlighted with change bars. So if I'm saying to someone, look, think about what I've said here and then come back with a new draft, I'd prefer for you to come back with the changes you've made highlighted in change bars. I don't want to read 20 pages, make comments, and then have to read the same 20 pages again, thinking what's changed here or what's different. So it's just in everybody's interest that we can see, what's been changed from draft to draft. So yeah, that's how I tend to operate. It just, I think, makes life easy for everybody. Okay, I'm not going to spend time on this. This is stuff that's taken from your handbook, so you can read through it in the interest of saving time here. This is it's more or less saying that you've got the main responsibility, but there are defined roles for both the supervisor and the student. And then there is an indicative schedule. Again, this is taken from this is Appendix F of the handbook. So there is a kind of a guideline schedule given to you there as to when things should be happening, roughly speaking. So again, if you haven't seen that, you should have a look at it. We're today on the 19th of October, so we're having the preparation tutorial as we speak. Now, with the best will in the world, and when are you going to do things and what are you going to do, and everybody starts off with the best of intentions, and it doesn't always work out that way, okay, because other pressures come on and you've got things to do, etc. And there has been a tendency for things to get back-end loaded because there isn't enough time to get things done, and we found that kind of results in people having too much to do towards the end. So again, the reality now is that we're looking for kind of more checkpoints along the way there. So we're going to be looking to you to have certain drafts of things at certain times. And again, it's all part of what I was saying earlier about trying to provide a little bit more scaffolding around this whole process, rather than just have you kind of out there working away more or less independently without a huge amount of support. So we will be looking to you to provide drafts at certain times so that we can see for definite what it is you're doing. And there will be submission boxes open on loop, yeah. For the various drafts to be put in. Okay. So the structure of the dissertation. Now this is kind of relatively straightforward because it's one of these things where almost every dissertation that you look at will have a similar structure. Okay, so you're not required to come up with any new great ideas as to how you're going to structure your dissertation. In fact, if you do come up with any new great ideas, you're probably going to be stopped. Told, no, sorry, red flowers are red, and etc. It's the way it's always been. So again, in Appendix G, it tells you what the dissertation design and layout requirements are. So it's all set out there, glossaries, lists of tables, and then the introduction, lit review, methodology, findings, conclusions. That's what your dissertation is going to look like. Okay, that is what it's going to look like. So, in terms of planning, that's how it will be. So read the antitrust legislation in the US. So it ended up with people writing versions of it that didn't have any AT&T code. And that guy at the bottom there, Andrew Tenenbaum, was another kind of key guy in the development of all this. And then you move on and you discover students starting to write versions of this Minix program. And now we end up with a guy called Linus Torvalds writing a version of that called Linux. And Linux is now used in multiple places today, multiple servers, very widely used. And if any of you have an Android phone in your pocket, then the very basic operating system that runs your phone is Linux. So you can trace an exact thread all the way back from Linux to that original Multics project. And just in terms of, when you look back at that and you look at the kind of technology and the approaches that they were having, the things that they were trying to do there, you can see the point I was just trying to make, that there's very few ideas that you can't trace back and find out what was going on historically, and what the background was to them, and what people have been trying to do, and what questions they've been trying to address. Likewise, cloud computing, everybody talks about cloud computing again as if it's something completely modern and a great new idea. And again, you can trace cloud right back to parts of the original Multics. And hands up, Multics, again, was based on other stuff. You can keep going back and back in all of those things and find original sources. So just be aware that sometimes when you're looking at something, don't just kind of assume that it's only the last couple of years that you have to look at. Often if you do look back, you'll find an awful lot of very useful and informative information about what happened in the past.
Sorry, for the purpose of the dissertation, how far back do we go?
I mean, there's no strict rule. I mean, I'm doing this really to say, if you are looking at something, like for example, you could be looking at mobile computing, that, just saying, okay, well, what's the idea behind mobile computing? Well, the idea is to try and, allow people, as wide a range of people as possible to operate in a computer, to operate applications, etc. So, why was that an idea? Where did it come from? So you can look back at things like this and say, well, there's always been an approach to try and serve as many people as it's possible to do. And if you look, for example, at that Multics thing, you'll see the kind of thoughts they had about how you operate security in that situation. If you've got lots and lots of people all sharing the same computing resources, how do I ensure that my information is kept separate from yours, etc.? So the whole idea of levels of security came in there. That guy, Fernando Corbado, was the first guy to come up with the idea of a password. Okay, so that way, you're kind of looking at stuff as basic as this. So what it can do is it can kind of just shine a light into what are the key underlying things that people were actually trying to address. Because sometimes when you just look at things in their modern format, you don't actually kind of get to the heart of what are the real underlying factors there. So it's very situation dependent,
I'm kind of thinking like at point you kind of go off topic.
Well, exactly, yeah. So I mean, you do have to look at. That's why I said if you look at the literature review and do a slice and dice, you're still going to have to, you're only going to be having about maybe 5,000 words of a literature review or something like that. So it's limited. But even within that, like if you can identify whatever the kind of key things are, you can still cover them quite well within that range. So it's just something to think about. Library resources, I'm not going to talk about because, as I said, you've got the stuff from Roman Cox. But you do need, just in terms of sources, you need to be careful about using kind of just journalistic type sources, okay, and the so-called grey literature. So your main topic, your main sources should ideally be peer-reviewed journals, textbooks, etc. Stuff from mainstream consultancies, etc. is good as well, governmental sources, but the bulk of it should come from peer-reviewed journals, etc. And you do need to be careful. There's a huge amount of information on the internet these days, so you just need to, exercise a lot of common sense as well in the sort of stuff that you learn. Okay, so peer-reviewed journals and books. I'm quite happy, things like The Economist, McKinsey Quarterly, for those of you in the technology areas, any of the big consultancies, Gartner, IDC, Forrester, Capgemini, Accenture, etc. All these people produce kind of good, in my view, good research. Now you always have to say, okay, it's not peer reviewed, they are commercial organizations, they may be pushing an agenda, but nonetheless, I think they're always worth reading. So by all means look at that. Government websites here, the Department of Business and Enterprise have some good stuff. The UK tend to publish a lot of good information, a lot of good reports, and they've got it now on a site called www.gov.uk. I had a look at this recently, and I actually think they've regressed a little bit. I think the previous version of that website was easier, was better in terms of the way they presented it. So, but you can still search for information on whatever area that you're looking at. And then you'll find various subject portals on the internet. So for example, business intelligence, there's one there, information management, there's one on supply chain management if you're interested in that area, etc. So that kind of stuff. So this is, this was I think McKinsey. Yeah, sorry, this is McKinsey. We're a big consultancy and they publish a lot of stuff, and you can sign up. Most of it is free, so you can sign up to them and you can get a kind of a weekly digest from them on stuff that they're publishing. They have a publication called McKinsey Quarterly, which they issue, and it's kind of, usually they do kind of in-depth interviews with different organizations, or they look at how something is developing in the States or in different parts of the world. So it's worth looking at that for kind of the modern take on something that's going on. There's also then more locally the Centres of Excellence, for example, the National Institute for Transportation Logistics, again on supply chain management. You can't really rely on journalism because it's, there's no real evidence of professionalism, professional ethics, etc. in journalistic articles. You can't rely on. You can read them fine, and they may give you some indications, but be very wary of quoting them. And don't please quote Wikipedia. Again, I'd say a little bit about Wikipedia later on. It can be a good place to as a jumping off point, but don't quote it, because what's in Wikipedia today can be completely different tomorrow. So anybody can go in and edit it. So it's not really it's not reliable or acceptable as a source in an academic publication. Ethics, again, I'm going to skip over because I think we have a separate session on ethics. When's the ethics? There's a separate session on ethics, is there?
Yeah, in February.
February,
yeah.
Okay. But again, it's an important issue, and it's become more and more important in recent times. So you will have to go through a quite formal process in terms of an ethics submission, and it goes to an ethics review committee, and they are looked at, very carefully. So when you come to do it, there are forms to fill in, etc., etc. So that's what you need to do. So in terms of doing your own research, you should at this stage, I guess, kind of have a global view of the task of doing your dissertation. But this kind of just put up there to kind of encapsulate it. So you'll have whatever issue it is that you're trying to investigate. Hypothesis is, as an expression, it's really kind of appropriate if you're doing quantitative research. So if you're really going to be studying the numbers on something and try to establish or prove things with statistical tests, then you'll be looking at the area of hypothesis. If you're not doing that, you're probably better off staying away from the use of the word hypothesis, I would suggest, because it does kind of have the connotation of being something that you're going to test quantitatively. Okay, so you've got the area that you're interested in. You're then going to do your literature review to find out, what do we know already about the topic that's under discussion. Then you're going to look at the specific issue that you want to address, so you're going to do your own primary research. You then take what you find, you plug it into what was already found in the literature review, and that's where you kind of draw these two things together. So you say, okay, this was the general background on this topic. We had a thing that we wanted to research, So we did our research, this is what we found. Now I'm going to plug that together, draw up, analyse it, come to a set of conclusions. Almost always, you'll come up and say, yeah, okay, but my research had certain limitations, etc. There were certain gaps still existing, and therefore there's going to be further research required in order to address questions that still remain. And it's quite valid to say that your research has actually left questions open. Okay? So you don't expect to absolutely nail down and have a very nice little neat box. Now, I've done it all. I've answered every question possible, and here it is. You know, and am I great? You know, none of us are that good. So your research is certainly going to leave gaps and questions, and part of the job is to identify what they are and point them out. So we've talked about the literature review. So your own research. So your research is going to be guided by a research methodology. Okay. Now this kind of is. This is important in terms of the thing we were talking about, having a coherent approach to everything. You see, Ireland's call is beginning to, the haka is forming in the background. So this is important because you have to have a coherent and a well-founded methodology for your research. This thing called Saunders Research Onion, I normally suggest to students to have a look at it as a guideline, because I think what it does is it presents in a very kind of visual way and therefore very accessible way a picture of the various layers and things that you're going to have to think about in order to define your research methodology. So I think using that as a basis, I would suggest is a good starting point. If you want to do something else, and if in conjunction with your supervisor you decide to do something else, that's well and good. But I think the research onion does kind of take you through from the outer to the inner, all of the steps that we need to go through in order to define a coherent and sensible research methodology that underpins the research questions that you have, and that leads you forward then into what you're going to do in terms of your primary research. So, as a sort of broad guideline, you've got kind of two, I would say. I'm stamping across very vast swathes of academic thinking here. Jerry's laughing at me. I don't blame you. This is definitely a kind of broad guide to what this stuff means. But you've got kind of two approaches, really. I would say, let's call them the positivist approach and the interpretivist approach. And positivism really means you're setting out to prove a hypothesis, prove it or disprove it. You're probably going to be you're going to set out with a theory, a kind of top-down theory that you're trying to prove or disprove, and therefore you're going to be using quantitative methods. You're going to be collecting numbers, and you're going to be running statistical tests on those numbers to say yay or nay to the hypothesis that you set out. Okay? So that's a positivist approach. An interpretivist approach means that you're not setting out with numbers. You're looking to find out more about the reasons why people think a certain thing, why they do a certain thing, what are the reasons behind. It's kind of more exploratory, okay? And that means you're adopting what's called an inductive approach, which is you're going down there in among all the mess, you're talking to people, you're finding out what they're thinking, and you're trying to say, okay, I'm going to gather all this together. I'm going to look at it and say, oh yeah, well, it looks as if this is what the theory is now. So you're actually taking the information, gathering it, and producing a theory. So that's an inductive approach to kind of bottom up, as opposed to coming in with a theory and setting out to prove it, which is the deductive approach. So if you're doing that second one, interpretivism, you're doing more qualitative research. Okay? And that's kind of pushing you down the area of kind of interviews a lot of the time. So you'd be doing semi-structured or something, interviews with people to try and find out what it is they're thinking about a certain topic. Okay. Now,
just a question on research data collection. So is there like a guideline of the amount of, say, subject matter people, experts that you need to speak to for a scale per se, like is 1 to 10 format, 1 to 40 format?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that feed into that. The amount of time you have available to do it is one of them.
Yeah.
So a kind of a common enough approach that people would have is, and like I've put those two things up there and said, this is one way of doing it, this is the other. Very frequently what you end up with is a kind of a mixed methods approach, where people do a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. So they do a little bit of quantitative and a little bit of qualitative, to one degree or another, and they come up with a mixed methods view. So just in terms of, again, the kind of philosophical wars that went on about whether, it was the only pure means of research was quantitative. This was going on for ages, and people, were kind of decrying qualitative a little bit. The kind of general view now is, well, a mixed method approach is a perfectly good way of doing it. But anyway, everything should be driven by what your research question is. You shouldn't really be coming in as a kind of an ayatollah of one approach or the other. You should just be looking at what is it I'm trying to do, what's the best way of doing it. And frequently a mixed methods approach is the way to do that. So to come back to the specific questions, so what you might then end up doing is trying to do a survey of kind of a number of people, make that as broad as you can. So try and get kind of some information back that show trends and guidelines on whatever it is you're interested in. And then maybe if you're seeing topics or issues emerging from that, maybe do 3 or 4 kind of in-depth interviews with people to try and see if you can get underneath what emerged from that quantitative type of research, and then try and say, okay, here's a trend we've seen, but having spoken to 3 or 4 people, we're seeing these as the reasons, etc. behind it. So that's a kind of a typical approach that people take.
John, just on the qualitative thing, I know it's hard to be scorched with this last year. Every year we say to people, the response rate on surveys that you get is going to be far less than you expect it to be. So people always think, oh, I'll use LinkedIn or my sources and I'll send out and everybody will reply to the survey, and they don't. And they don't. So if you are doing a quantitative survey, you need to sort of, without sort of paying people, you need to in some ways incentivize people to respond, because people are sick to the eye teeth of getting surveys in their email, and they don't respond, So you and to have a realistic picture of whatever it is that you're looking at, you need to be getting something around 100 responses at the very least, So if you come up with a survey result and you've got 15 replies and you say, well, sure, that's all I got, it takes the credibility from the research that you've done. It means that the only people who responded were this particular cohort, and it may not be reflective of what it is that you're actually. So yeah, do surveys. I'm not saying don't do them, but be aware that the response rate and the timing of the response rate is going to be far less than you expect it to be, and that's why people often, particularly experienced supervisors, will say, really you probably need a few qualitative interviews to back up the quantitative.
I suppose too, it can depend on, like, if you're doing it in a small organisation, you may not have those kind of, I guess what you're saying is where you're looking at a very broad kind of target population that you're looking at. But if you're just doing something in your own company, and if you've only got 100 people, then obviously your response rate probably won't be 100%, but it'll be, because your target population is so small, the responses that you do get will be kind of valid once there's no bias, etc. in those. So I'm not going to. I've already said this really, actually. So kind of the idea behind the positivist approach, what that is, and how it differs from the qualitative ones. So you can have a look at those slides afterwards if you want to. Just go back through that. But your supervisor will go through this stuff with you anyway and kind of give you a guideline. But I think between using something like the Research Onion, having this idea, kind of a general idea of what it is in terms of positivism, interpretivism, etc. I think this is covered in, or was covered in research methods anyway, wasn't it? Yeah, so so I shouldn't sound like I'm speaking Esperanto here, hopefully. Okay, so you need to, just basically, you need to justify your choice of methodology. So you don't need to kind of write an essay on research methods within your dissertation. You don't need to say, here's what quantitative means and here's what qualitative. Spend ages doing that. All you need to do is show an understanding. So I would say use something like the research onion and just say, because I'm researching X, I'm adopting a mixed methods approach, and I'm doing this bit of quantitative, that bit of qualitative, and that fits in with, you know, this stage is on the research onion, and just ensure that the whole thing coherently hangs together. Okay, so you've just got to establish for anybody reading it that you kind of go, okay, you understand the general landscape here, and you've got a good handle on it, and what you're doing makes sense in terms of your particular research. So you don't need an essay. Okay. There is a danger, and I mentioned this, if you're doing something on a single company or within your own organization, it can be very beneficial because it's got great proximity, you've got access to people, you know the ground, etc. The danger is something slips. So you're relying on a particular project for your dissertation, and suddenly it's put off for 6 months. You know, there's plenty of times that this kind of thing can happen. So if you are doing something within your own organization, by all means do it, you know, go in with your eyes open and try to kind of do a bit of a risk analysis as to whether or not there's something in here that could trip you up.
John, on that as well, if it's on your own organisation, you'll already have your own assumptions and opinions because you're in there and you know the way things work. So it's quite hard, but you do really need to make sure you remove any biases you have about that organisation or the way things work. It has to be backed up by research and.
Yeah, as Anne says there, I mean, you go within your own organisation, there is an obvious question of whether you've got a biased position. There's also an issue that if you're interviewing, like, be very careful interviewing staff, anyone who works for you. That's a kind of a big issue as far as ethics is concerned, because there's a power relationship there between you and the person you're interviewing. The danger is they'll tell you what you want to hear, or maybe what makes you sound good as opposed to what they're really thinking. So that's a kind of an area that you have to be careful about. So you can source information, survey interviews, questionnaires, looking at other case studies. These are typical ways of doing it. Again, just to comment, so far as you can, try use graphics in presenting your findings rather than lots and lots of verbiage. A, it can save you, lots and lots of words, and B, it breaks up the text and you can really illustrate an awful lot with graphs. So even simple graphs out of something like Excel, etc., can be very useful in doing that. And you don't need to be a statistics expert to present information. I mean, descriptive statistics, as I'm sure Bridget covered in her stuff, even descriptive statistics can really throw an awful lot of light on a particular set of information that you've calculated. So, what's the average here, how spread out is the data, etc., etc. These kind of things can give a lot of information, even staying well away from sort of complicated statistical tests. So again, I should really put an asterisk on that bottom one, but it really comes to the point Colin was saying, don't expect to get really high percentages of response rates, particularly if you're trying to spread the net wide and you don't know a lot of the people that you're surveying. The closer you are to the people that you're surveying in terms of working within your own organisation, generally the higher the response rate that you should expect, if for no other reason than you're going to be going around beating them about the ears saying, will you answer that research thing I sent you, please, Whereas if there are people that you don't really have any connection to, it's much more difficult to do that. A much higher chance that it just goes straight into the bin.
John, can I just say something?
Sure.
Just in relation to if you're doing it at your own workplace, in the ethics section of chapter 5 of the handbook, it's worth reading that because it just gives some guidelines, or it might preempt some awkward situation that you might think is harmless question. There's useful information there in terms of if it's not appropriate. If questions you think are appropriate, they may not really work out well. So it's worth reading that section on it.
Chapter 5?
Yeah.
Chapter 5.
It's kind of examples of situations and projects.
Okay, I'm conscious of time here. So I'm not going to go through all of them, try and summarize these things. Think about who, if you're going to do a survey or you're thinking of, trying to get who it is in your target population, how you're going to access them. You need to think about that as early as you can. Okay, so depending on what it is you're looking at, then you need to think about who are the right people that I need to speak to. How am I going to get access to those people? Okay, so you've got a target population, but then you need to identify a thing called a sampling frame. So how are you going to actually, what is the list of people? So if I want to, you're not going to be, but if I wanted to do a survey of, adults in general in Ireland, okay, so that's my target population. I might use the register of electors or something as a sampling frame. Where do I actually get a list of who these people are so that I can start trying to get access to them? Okay, so you need to start thinking about those kind of things. So if you're moving outside your own organisation, do you have a personal network, or do you need to go wider than that? Who are you going to speak to start trying to build up that contact list? Because the other thing that you need to try and do is to ensure that the people who are answering your questionnaire or whatever are the actual people that you need to talk to. Okay, now it can be difficult to police that, but you need to be kind of careful of the danger that you want to send a survey to production managers and get them to answer it. So the production manager in company A gets this thing and is looking at it and going, all right, okay, I'm not going to bother with that. And then he gets a follow-up from you. And he or she goes, okay, I'm going to answer this now. But actually, there's a problem on line 8 this morning, so actually, are you busy at the moment? Here, will you answer that? And suddenly, you don't know who's answering it. So you need to try and police that as best you can, right? It can be difficult, but, so the extent to which you can have some sort of personal contact with all of the people that are going to be involved in responding to surveys, then the better. The kind of wider and more spread out it becomes, the less control you have over that kind of thing. So again, the world ain't perfect, but you just need to try and sort of think about these things. Who you talk to, okay, list of companies who you contact. And the key point really at the bottom is don't underestimate the logistics of doing that. So again, the earlier you start trying to think about that, the better. Because it can take a while to set up. Again, okay, make sure if you're asking questions, depending on what it is that you're investigating. So if you're investigating things at the company level, then you need to be asking questions at the company level. If you're trying to find out about people's individual personal perceptions, then you need to ask them about their personal perceptions. So again, we keep coming back to the coherence all the way through. Make sure that all this stuff, logically hangs together. Okay, so triangulation again is a term that you may find, and doing interviews alongside surveys is a method of triangulation. And triangulation really means finding sources that will cross-reference or support the conclusions that you come to. So if you can find other published data as well, this all helps along this idea of triangulation. Okay, would suggest pre-test. If you come up with a survey, you're designing a survey, come up with a draft of it, think about whether the content is valid, is the meaning clear, are terms clear, are you using jargon maybe that only you're familiar with and that people who are receiving the survey may not be familiar with? Okay, are there any wording problems, ambiguity, bias, etc., etc.? I'll give a few silly examples here, but they're silly, but some of them are silly, some of them aren't. Just to think about it. Okay, so question, how long have you worked in your current role? Right, what's wrong with that? Sorry?
Ambiguous.
Well, how is it ambiguous? No, you don't answer, sorry, I'm not here.
For example, if you after 5 years, you 2 boxes you could take.
Yeah, 5 is captured twice. So if I'm 5 years, which box do I tick? And you can say it doesn't matter, but actually it might matter in another. Okay, so overlapping categories, classic one. Again, this is a silly example, I will admit, but it does just highlight that you can come into something with a sort of a bias, particularly if you're very passionate about something and you're trying to say, okay, I really think this, and I'm now going to go out and survey it, and you're projecting your view of the world onto the person that you're surveying, as opposed to asking a neutral question. Okay, so you need to be careful of research or bias in the questions that you're asking. There's a kind of classic one that they have somewhere, I'm sure you'll find it on YouTube, where there's about 5 questions. And the idea is to get people to say whether or not they support the death penalty. And if you ask one set of questions, nearly everybody will say they do. Another set of questions, everyone will say they don't. Because what you're doing is you're kind of giving examples to suit your particular view on it, you know. So you'll be talking about asking, are you aware how many people who have been executed and subsequently exonerated, blah, blah, you know, and you're leading people to say, no, I don't support it. And another set of questions, you're leading them to support it. So you have to be very careful about introducing bias into the questions. Okay, double-barreled ones again. This is a kind of a classic one. You know, how useful and cost-effective do you find your current internet service? And what's wrong with that? 2 questions in one. Okay, so particularly if you're using Likert scale type answers, so how satisfied are you, or how useful? Very useful, extremely useful, you know, middle and not sure, not very useful, really crap. But actually I might think, yeah, it's really useful, but geez, I have to pay through the teeth for it. So yes, it's useful, but no, it's not cost effective. But how do I answer that question? Because there's actually 2 questions. Similarly with the second one, where you made welcome by your manager and fellow workers. Yeah, I could have been made welcome by my manager and not by my fellow workers, or vice versa. So I actually can't answer the question validly. So be careful to just ask one question each time. Okay? Don't ask multiple questions, because you don't know what you're dealing with then. And this is just an example I've taken from the past of trying to take an original draft and, you know, get the kind of double barrels out of it in some way or other, although I suspect there's at least one double barrel remaining in there somewhere. Okay. And again, you know, doing a kind of a pre-test with people and saying, okay, can you complete this draft survey, and then just go back with them and say, well, what did you understand by this, etc. And you might find that people might interpret things differently, which might suggest to you that you need to reword something in some way. So doing a pre-test I would absolutely recommend, because you can really iron out a lot of problems. You don't want to find that there's an interpretation issue when you've actually issued your instrument and you're getting the information back because it's too late. That's it. Okay, and again, very often when we get research or draft surveys, there's a tendency for them to be very long. Okay, the shorter you can make it, the better, because there's much more chance of it actually being answered. And so therefore, every question that you're thinking about asking, okay, I'd say, just look at it and say, okay, like, first of all, what's the purpose of this question? Why am I asking this question in the first place? And if you can't get a valid answer to that, consider knocking the question out. You get an awful lot of these. How long have you worked in your present role? And how long have you worked with the company? And half the time, you know, absolutely no use is made of that information subsequently. So if it doesn't actually matter to you, don't ask the question. Now, and again, you know, there's always a kind of a little caveat. Sometimes you can ask a question. Sometimes when you get your data back, you can actually see trends in that, you know, all the men have answered one way or something, or all the women have answered another way. So sometimes asking categorizing type questions can be useful, because you can kind of see trends happening. So definitely for every question you're thinking about, kind of think about it. Is it sufficient? Is it necessary? Does it fit logically? So if you want to ask a kind of set of demographic questions, ask them at the start and then move on to something else. So don't kind of mix and match, and, you know, because people are kind of, you know, kind of bouncing around from one thing to another. And so trying as well, maybe if you're going to ask questions in a positive way, so ask questions that are, you know, where you're asking the question in a positive way, rather than flip-flopping between the two. Because if you start flip-flopping between the two, then people are kind of, their mind is in a gear that says, I'm being asked positive questions here. And then if you suddenly put a question in a negative term, you know, you can catch them out and they can be kind of answering the opposite way to what you intend. Okay, so try and ask questions in a consistent, positive way, and also don't kind of make things difficult for people to understand, because again, the more you do that, the bigger the risk is of getting invalid responses back. In terms of things that can support you, Qualtrics. We've got some resources available on Loop on Qualtrics as kind of surveying software. SurveyMonkey is there as well, if you want to use that. There's information, as I'm showing there, on OS20 about that. Interviewing, just again briefly, this is something that you'll probably do both in terms of the thing we mentioned about triangulation, but also getting a richer set of information. The more interviewing you can do, the better. There are different types of interviewing, and you'll have come across this in research methods. Structured interviewing, you have to ask exactly the same questions of everybody and code the information up. So it's really like a form of survey, kind of face-to-face. The more normal one is a semi-structured interview, where you've got a general approach to what you're going to do, an idea of the questions and the areas that you're going to cover. But depending on what your interviewee says back to you, you've got the latitude to kind of wander off topic a little bit or investigate things a bit more. Because sometimes people can say things kind of just make a chance remark, but they can actually be very interesting chance remarks, and if you tunnel into it a bit, you can kind of develop some useful information. So that's a semi-structured approach, and then unstructured is kind of going in really without much of an agenda, which I think is quite difficult. So in having an interview schedule doesn't mean when am I going to have interviews, it means having a list of questions and a sequence and a way in which you're going to go about that. Definitely record and transcribe and check that your recording device, if it's your phone or whatever, is working. You know, make sure that it's actually working when you go in. There's nothing worse than having it there and then going along afterwards, just hearing blank sounds or hearing all the traffic noise outside and the occasional few words. So test it in the conditions in which the interview is taking place. Because sometimes if it's noisy and you know these auto sensing levels, they can go up and down depending on what's happening in the background. And when you are interviewing, like I would say, practice interviews as much as you can before you get out and start interviewing people, because it's quite a skill to interview someone, and if you've never done it before, it's actually quite challenging. To be suddenly you're the person asking the question, and that can be difficult. And so don't be enthralled. Don't just sort of, I have a set of questions, I have to ask all these questions. I'm not really listening to what the person is saying. I just want to make sure I ask all these questions. If you don't understand things, look for clarification, etc. Don't sort of go down a rabbit hole. And again, do a trial run. I would say definitely, practice interviewing people. If you can get a kind of a pet guinea pig, or someone who'll agree to be interviewed, then do that. Get some feedback from them afterwards as to how they felt during the interview, etc. Was it too fast, too slow, etc. Okay, surveys, mixed things, triangulation, we've mentioned already. Okay, be careful. Every business has its jargon, so again, be careful using jargon to people who may not understand it, and be careful if people start using jargon back to you, and if you don't know what they mean exactly, if they start using acronyms, just say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, would you mind explaining? Because if you let it go too far, it gets to the point where you can't sort of say, 10 minutes ago you mentioned AVX, what exactly does that mean? The person's going, hang on, I've been talking for 10 minutes about this. Now you're asking me, what does it mean? So you just need to be careful and confident, I guess. Okay, presenting findings graphically, as I mentioned, great way of doing it. Okay, and it's not anything you have to be super efficient with in terms of knowledge of things. These are all taken from Excel, presenting stuff graphically from Excel. Very good way of doing it. So, conclusions. Okay, place where you got target thinking. Now this is, as I mentioned before, a place at which a lot of good dissertations can fall down. You really have to think about how you're presenting your conclusions, because this is the kind of essence of what it is that's gone in your dissertation previously. This is really where you're saying, this is the kind of elevator pitch almost. This is what I've concluded from all of this. So you get into the lift with your boss who's been funding your research project. He goes, how you doing, Mike? How's that going? What did you find out? You're going, so this is the kind of bit where you have to have your 30 seconds ready to say, well, this is actually what I found. And as somebody famous said, you don't really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother. Now, that's not very PC, is it? No, You can put in grandfather, grandperson, significant other generational distant relative. But anyway, I think you get the idea. Anybody know who said that? So it's a summary and your recommendations for the research. So just a few, but what I would say is, don't get the whitewash fever. The place where you really spend some time writing up your conclusions. Don't think, one page or 3 or 4 paragraphs. You just kind of said, yeah, well, that's it, I'm out of here. Because, and I'm sure Jerry might back me up on this, sometimes when you're looking at a research dissertation, you've not been involved in it before, sometimes there's a tendency to sort of start reading it from the back, and have a quick look at the conclusions before you go and read through the whole thing. So actually, it's very important, I think, to write a coherent and good set of conclusions. So leave yourself some thinking time to do that. Okay, it's not just kind of wrap it up and dismiss it and mass. It's really where you need to kind of say, this is it. This is what I found good. Okay, the general points are just again. There's a marking scheme you can have a look at. It's there it is. Common problems, so pitfalls that we've come across. Not starting. It sounds silly, isn't it? But actually, you have to kind of start writing something. Commit some thoughts and ideas to paper. You can do an awful lot of analysis and get an awful lot of paralysis, but at some point start writing something or start sketching down ideas or notes or whatever. Just the process of writing, the physical activity of doing something, will get the kind of creative juices flowing and you'll start to get other ideas from it. If you just do too much research and reading, you can kind of kill yourself. You really have to start writing something at some stage. Do actually get started. The purpose not being clear, we said earlier to try and get the idea of what it is you're doing clear in your mind, because everything flows from that. If that's not clear, then the thing is going to be rocking backwards and forwards from that point on. Okay, not getting drafts on time, underestimating the effort. This is just kind of summarizing, I guess, stuff that I said earlier, describing stuff rather than doing analysis, not tying the findings and conclusions into the research objectives. This is an important point, I think. When you get to, the conclusion stage or somewhere towards the end there, always go back. You'll have stated at the start some research questions or objectives. So it's really good practice to say, now, okay, we've gone through all of this. Now let's go back and remind ourselves that these are the questions we asked at the start, or these are the objectives we set ourselves. So here, in summary, is the answer to research question 1. Here's the answer to research question 2. Or here's what I found in relation to research objective 1 and 2. Because that literally gets all those threads that are going, ties them all back in a neat knot, back to what you started with at the time. So if you've got a clear set of questions, a structured literature review that reflects what you're doing, a research methodology that's logical and coherent in answering those questions, a set of conclusions that has some thought put into it, and then go back and kind of say, here's what I asked, here's what I wanted to do originally, now, based on all of that, here are the answers in summary to what I set out to. So that will kind of give you, if you manage to do all of that, you'll have a very coherent, dissertation done at that point. So it's as easy as that. Sorry, okay. Just a couple of general things. You don't write in the first person. This is just so you don't use I, me, mine, etc. That's just an academic convention. So you kind of write in the third person. Have a look at some of the existing dissertations that are up on the system, just if that's kind of foreign to you, just to get an idea. I mean, just write in your normal style. If you really want to look at style guides, then there's ones available. Make sure that you kind of get into the idea of referencing things. Okay, so don't kind of make general statements that somebody could say, says who, or, according to who. So just be careful all the way through it to make sure you do that. When you are citing from sources, don't kind of quote, don't kind of say, Fred Blogg said this, and then quote about, 14 lines or something, and then say, and Joe Soap said this, and quote another 14 lines. You're really expected to paraphrase it yourself and put it into your own words. So whatever it is that your source said, you should really be saying, okay, I've read that, and this is what he said, but it's in your own words. But there will be times when you need to quote something directly for emphasis, but it should be used sparingly. Okay, so you're expected to kind of paraphrase this and show your understanding of it in your own words. And you have to use the Harvard system of bibliographical referencing. That's the, and there's a guide up there, cite and write, version 10. But our friend Zotero, if you use Zotero, which is freely available to you, then it takes all of the donkey work out of this. And it really, if you haven't been using it up to now, I strongly suggest you. It's not really, you know, if you invest a half an hour or an hour into checking it out, you'll get the hang of it quite well. Is everybody using something like that? Does anybody not use it? Yeah? Okay, great. If you're not, I'd suggest you do. Okay, and again, you can read through these. These are just common spelling mistakes. Some of them I just kind of wonder how they keep appearing. But anyway, not principle or principle. This one I just find amazing how many times these are misspelled. You know, even as recently as about 2 weeks ago, I got an invitation from this august institution to partake in something or other, and it informed me that the principal researcher was somebody, Princidle. So anyway, it obviously wasn't a research into English literature or anything. Anyway, there you go. So lots of them. Complement and complement, another one that keeps appearing. No text speak, and this one in the middle, could have, should have, and might have. Again, I presume this is coming from text, but it's just, it's creeping in everywhere, so just watch out for it. And try and stay away from what I would call gobbledygook. Gobbledygook is, you know, write in kind of normal English is what I would suggest. And just be careful of kind of, you know, using the kind of language that really, you know, people look at and go, well, what are you actually saying there? So it was, I don't know, she's retired now to go off teaching maths to kind of underprivileged children in London, Lucy Calloway. I don't know if you ever read any of her stuff. She used to work right for the Financial Times, but every year she used to have an award ceremony where she compiled all the junk stuff and rubbish that was spoken during the year, and made awards for it. So I mean, it's just there for a bit of fun. But what I would say is just kind of write in normal English and try and avoid too much kind of jargon. You know, just use your own words, etc. Okay. The other thing is, if you are using good old Microsoft to do your document, this might be the first time you're using you have a substantial document to manage. So acquaint yourself again, spend a little bit of time and find out how to use sections, how to use headings. Because if you do that, you'll really make life an awful lot easier for yourself. If you're trying to handle this manually, you know, section numbers and headings, and then you try to add in something or insert something or move something around, it's an absolute nightmare. Okay, so if you get used to the idea of how headings and styles work, then adding in a new section, moving them around, you know, it takes care of all that for you. It renumbers and reformats, and it automatically creates a table of contents for you. So if you're not doing it, I'm sure most of you probably are. If you're not, again, just spend a bit of time. There's loads of facilities available on YouTube, lots of explanatory stuff, etc., telling you how to do it. Make references, etc. That's what your reference list will look like. If you're using Zotero, it'll do it for you automatically, and when you insert the references within your text, again, they look like that. But I think most of you probably have this stuff off by now. So if you are using Zotero, it works best with Chrome or Firefox as well, I believe. It doesn't work well with Internet Explorer because it doesn't give you the little add-in that you've got there, which will enable you to convert or to save things. So that little arrow there at the top, that little symbol in Chrome, when you're on a particular page or in a document, if you click on that, it will add it into your Zotero database in whatever folder is open at a particular time. So again, very handy way of building up resources. And it gives you an add-in into Word, so you can click on it and then insert a citation or add your references. Okay, plagiarism. Again, At this stage, I'm sure all of you have been through the mill on this, so you know what to do or not to do, and we've got plenty of supports, etc. available to you. Do you want me to stop now? I mean, I have an example here on using sources, but it's really only, by the by, it's not particularly. Our own time on this,
Or is there 15 minutes down?
Perfect.
15 minutes down.
Probably won't be anybody rushing out to do anything. Okay, then. Also, this is just. So it's another one of these things, looking backwards to look forwards. Okay, so let's say you're looking at kind of issues, management issues in the court service, for instance, or the legal dimension to environmental concerns, or marketing, privacy, social media, etc. So if you're looking at kind of the legal background, you might look back historically, and I'm going to link this into something that's going on at the moment, or has been going on in the UK. So you might find that a landmark case in the development of law in the US, this case goes way back to 1803, called Marbury versus Madison. It established this notion of judicial review, which is the courts having the right to say what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. Okay, it's a very fundamental kind of idea, but it has an interesting historical development, but also then, a place in kind of very much so in the modern world. So this case, Marbury versus Madison, is, as I said, it's a fundamental, it's a really bedrock case in American law, and it has spread from America to lots of other common law countries, to the extent that that graphic there is actually a plaque on the wall in the US Supreme Court building, and it's a quote from the Chief Justice, kind of the key phrase that established the notion of judicial review, which is him saying that it's actually the job of the judicial part of the overall government to say what the law is and what the law isn't. So if you're looking for information about something like that, now you can go to the library and use all of the search facilities that you've got there officially, or you can go to Google Scholar, etc. But if you're looking kind of just looking for it, now our friend Wikipedia is usually a good source, just as a starting point. So if suddenly you go Marbury versus Madison, what's that all about? Have a quick look into Wikipedia, and you will actually probably get some quite useful information in there. So it can be a kind of a good starting point to have a look at something. But you need to move on then, and you will typically then be looking at kind of peer-reviewed journals or something like that. So you might end up looking at something like the Harvard Law Review, or something where there's a review of this case and a discussion about its significance and its continuing significance in the world today. And then if you want to, you can actually go to what are called primary sources, which is the original actual material, so the actual decision in this case in the US Supreme Court. Okay, so that's kind of layers, if you like, of sources that you can go to find out information. Now, one of the interesting things about that particular case, just by the way, was it was a kind of the courts were presented with a kind of a gotcha, and it's often in cases where courts are presented with a gotcha that interesting things can develop, because there was a change of government, and there was one of these kind of midnight set of appointments. So the courts, a lot of lower level courts were filled with people from the outgoing administration, if I can use that expression. And there was a question then about whether that was valid and whether they would be allowed to stand with the new administration coming in, which of course would have significantly destabilized the incoming government. So the court was faced with this kind of a dilemma as to what to do here. So what the Chief Justice did was, as they say, he kind of gave in on a small item in order to gain on the big one. So what he did was he said, yeah, actually those were valid appointments because, that's the job of the government to appoint judges at that level, so I can't interfere with that. But then he said the actual statute that enables the Supreme Court to do that has to be wrong, because the overriding constitution says the Supreme Court is only an appellate court. It can only hear appeals. It can't actually originate anything. So therefore, while I agree, and I'm not going to interfere with the government's role, actually that statute is unconstitutional, so the whole thing falls in. So he was kind of giving in on one bit, but he was establishing, in order to do that, he was establishing the whole concept of judicial review. Again, what's interesting in some ways about that is it didn't have any great kind of philosophical background. It wasn't the result of any great thinking. It was as a result of effectively 2 guns to the head of the judicial branch in America and just trying to decide what to do about it. But out of that came a very fundamental concept that kind of has reverberated right down in time, the notion of judicial review. And actually, if you've been following the infamous Brexit stuff lately, you'll be familiar that the UK Supreme Court actually told Boris Johnson that what he had done in terms of proroguing Parliament was effectively unconstitutional, even though the UK doesn't have a written constitution. But the court made it clear that it was their call as to whether or not this was the right thing to do. And if you remember, the debate in England was about whether or not it was a political decision and whether the courts had any role in it at all. And the High Court in the UK kind of kicked it upstairs and said, well, we know it's going to the Supreme Court anyway, and it looks like it's political, so we're not getting involved. It went to the Supreme Court, and that was people there in the fancy dress, are the justices of the UK Supreme Court, Lady Hale being the Chief Justice. And afterwards, there was something in a write-up on it in the Financial Times, just referencing that particular decision in the UK Supreme Court. And interestingly, you can see there that they actually mentioned about the original case on which the whole kind of concept of judicial review was based, which was Marbury versus Madison. So again, it's just a kind of, you can say, well, what's the point of all that? But it's really just to show you that when you do look backwards, or when you look kind of underneath things and try to see what's going on, you can actually kind of gain an understanding of the reasoning behind things, why certain things came into effect. And in some cases, as in this one, it wasn't the result of some great philosophical debate. It was actually the courts trying to decide how do we get out of jail here. But it actually, spawned a very fundamental precept of law that's come all the way down to it. So, anyway, say again?
Tend to know if you want to open it up to questions.
Well, like I said, I can questions anytime you want. So, okay, you're going to just do a process of reading and drafting and redrafting, etc. And that's kind of that's the way it is as you go along. Again, within I think in the handbook, there's various milestones that they give you to help you along the way there. Okay, planning is good, writing is mandatory. Like I said, you have to actually make a start. You have to start writing at some point. That's what I would say. And the process of writing kind of gets you out of the potential for analysis paralysis, which was suffered by our good friend Hamlet back in the day when he had that problem. So, I think that's pretty much it. Okay. Stone silence.
But then you do the checklist,
Yeah.
like 2, 3, 5, 5.
Checklist. Yes.
What was that?
That's from the course handbook. It isn't. It was back in the day. Interesting.
Sorry, what was the question?
The checklist, of different steps you go through.
This one
Yeah,
here.
that's in it, yeah, it's in appendix.
In the handbook, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Oh, you'd have read that. You must have missed that. It's just a checklist to help you kind of, things that you need to be doing. You all read the manual. Yeah.
To what extent does a reader need to get an explanation of the subject matter that you're dealing with? So let's say you mentioned lean. Does somebody have to have an understanding of lean? Are you assuming that they have an understanding of lean?
No, don't assume that they understand, because you're then putting them in the position that they have to assume you understand. They kind of can't do that, So you have to say, okay, your research area is lean technology, so the idea of lean technology is boom, 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 reference, somebody. And then, so that's kind of early on, you're stating what it is. Then when you get into your literature review, you kind of take the framework that I had there, you might say, okay, so what's lean all about? Well, lean kind of is one of the things that developed from maybe the general idea of quality and elimination of waste. So both quality management, Six Sigma, just-in-time technologies, the lean approach, all of these things are kind of part of the general trend that you can look at on the canvas. So where does lean fit in exactly into this? Where is it applicable? Where has it been used? Etc. So you're not, so therefore you are kind of explaining, you don't have to go into huge amount of details, but you have to demonstrate that you know what lean is, where it fits in the kind of broad range of things, and that you've got some academic research on lean to back up. So don't assume anything, I would say, in terms of what the reader knows, because you're in the business of projecting to the reader to say what you know about it. So there isn't any kind of shared, like we all know Ireland is a country that's in Europe, you know, there are certain things that are common knowledge, you don't have to kind of repeat everything. But things like a brief explanation of what your general subject matter is, and positioning it in the kind of academic theory or whatever it is, definitely you need to do that.
And that would go in the research or the literature review?
It would, I think it would be upfront in terms of the introduction and background. So, you know, the very first thing in the end, what am I doing? I'm investigating lean. So you'll have a title for your thing. So immediately you're going to be saying, well, the purpose of the research is to investigate lean practices in an Irish pharmaceutical company. So this is looking, I'm going to look at how lean technologies or approaches are used in order to boom, 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 boom. So then in the literature review, you'll get into, okay, what is lean? You know, where did it come from? What's it supposed to do? What are its benefits? If you take that scheme idea, you'll be looking at a lot of aspects of lean and it'll, you know, become very evident that you know what you're talking about. Anybody else?
Said about Taylor Baking reference document. You can do this in Word as well in a very simple way. Why do you think that there's something more than
Yeah, you can do it in Word in a simple way in that you've got, you know, something on the ribbon in Word and you can say, okay, do this thing here now. Now, again, forgive me if I'm wrong, but what you may not end up with is kind of a repository then of articles and documents separate from your particular Word document. So if you use Zotero, you'll end up with a database and you can organize it, you can set up a hierarchy of folders. So you can have one on, you know, my dissertation in general, your literature review, subsections of the literature review. So you can put in articles, you can put in books, you can put in web pages, all the different type of things, conference papers. And if you say, you know, if you come up with, let's say it's a conference paper, and you've got it on your screen as you're opening, you click on the little icon that I have on the thing. So what it will do is it will look at it and say, okay, this is a conference paper. So I know that in order to format this for the Harvard system, this is what it should look like. So it works out what it is that you're looking at, and it sets it up exactly correctly. So when you go to cite it, you're not worried about what it is or what it should look like. It handles all that. Now just a slight word of caution, it doesn't always do it perfectly. Okay, so sometimes, you may have found this, sometimes when you're taking it across, it may not capture everything, you know, and you might look at it and go, well, hang on a minute, it doesn't have the author there. And you might have to do it a second time, or you might have to save the PDF separately and then just drag and drop it in, but usually works well most of the time, okay? And, you know, you might have to do a little bit of editing sometimes. But I having used the Word one, and you're right, it's a long way up from doing everything manually. But I just think there's a huge step difference between that and using something like Zotero. I think it gives you a lot richer an environment.
For the research proposal due in November, is that supposed to be like a miniature version of the dissertation?
A miniature version of it?
Of the dissertation?
Kind of, but it's more, it's yes and no. Like it's obviously hugely smaller. But what it should do, if you can at all, is capture the general subject area that you're going to look at and what your ideas are in terms of how you're going to do it. So you know, it's not required to be detailed beyond that because it doesn't have the length or depth. But yeah, it should be. If possible, don't diverge too much from that because, again, as I said earlier, we use it to try and match you up to a supervisor.
Is that used for your overall grade? Like, is it marked towards your overall
No. No. Its main purpose is it's got two things really. It's a checklist, it's a checkpoint to say, okay, where are you in terms of your thinking? You know, are you kind of looking like you're heading in the right direction? If you're not, it's to try and, you know, intervene at that point and do something about it. And if you are, then it's to try and say, well, okay, who's the best supervisor for this from this point?
So I know later on we're going to have a chance to kind of briefly discuss our front page.
Yeah.
Will we have a chance to discuss the proposal before submitting it? Or submitting it?
Before submitting,
I don't think so.
that out to the
There will be, you know, that is the purpose of the single page submission, to see if you're on track for the next stage, which would be the research proposal.
The actual submission later before we submit it.
No, do you mean in terms of the research proposal, or you
Yeah.
want to, well, if you can do it today, great, but, you know, we wouldn't consult before
Okay.
students submit it.
So
We are looking at the single page submissions, so if there's anything concerning us there, we want to isolate those ones and talk to students about them. But not, we wouldn't go in again on guidance on the research proposal.
And we're kind of looking at the one pagers, just
Yeah.
trying to see at a gross level, is there anything major here that's going to be problematic? Or to try and see, you know, is the scope too wide, is it shut down?
So basically I'm asking them to, after today, then we will, I think November 11, we submit our proposal.
Yeah.
And that's basically entirely we do it ourselves without any guidance.
Except that
Well, no, there
you'll be matched with a supervisor after that, and then
Yeah.
you can have discussions and refinements.
There's an exemplar on Oscar as well, isn't
Yeah,
there?
there is.
The
Yeah,
research
exemplars.
proposal exemplar, so you
There's
can have a
3
look
of them.
at
Yeah.
the kind of things that people have done before.
And today then when we go into our own groups, is the plan to kind of look at, in say groups of 4, you're kind of steering this way, or that's what's the plan?
Well, you actually, for this afternoon, you're going to pick a topic and take this through the dissertation management tool. But you can also ask your group facilitator, you can have a look at, you can discuss with them your single page submission as well. But you can decide between yourselves, you can use one of your own topics, or you can, a member of the group can propose their research topic to take it through it.
All blanks time then, is it?
Just one question on the formats. It looks like from the exemplars that are out there, there's several different format of documents that have been used. Is there any strict format that must be followed, like a strict font, a strict report format?
There are guidelines
There are, yeah, it's on the-
on the system, so I remember them off the top of my head, but it's like 1.5 line spacing at least, so don't go single spacing.
That is really for the dissertation, your final submission, you know.
Yeah. Sorry, we're talking about final dissertation.
Yeah, like it's easier to get these right at the start as opposed to just have to revise them.
So again, have a look at it. It's all laid
It's an
out,
appendix,
chapter and verse in
yeah,
the program.
it's G or H.
So well spaced out, and, you know, font size is specified there.
And it tells you, on that one, it also tells you the layout of the chapters, and the abstract and acknowledgements, etc. So it's there.
Okay.